Here are amazing historical photos that you've hardly seen before. Subscribe. I have such rare collections coming out every day. Theatrice Bailey tried to clean the Lorraine Motel balcony just after the attack on Martin Luther King in 1968. The photo was taken in Memphis, Tennessee, and the motel became the National Civil Rights Museum in 1991. Finnish engineers test a captured Soviet ROX 2 fire projector in deep snow during an exercise in Onus in March 1943. The ROX 2 was built to look like a normal rifle, while its fuel tank was hidden in a backpack. French soldiers stand in full protective suits in northern Saudi Arabia during the Gulf Crisis in October 1990. France sent about 18,000 troops in Operation Daguet, its largest overseas deployment since Algeria. A French infantryman in 1916 carried a full field kit with an Adrian helmet, horizon blue coat, Liebel rifle, gas mask, shovel, and food bag. France adopted horizon blue in 1915 after the old red trousers proved too easy to spot from a distance. B-26, Idiot's Delight. 2 came back on August 27, 1943, with a huge section of its tail ripped open by ground fire. The Martin B-26 Marauder flew more than 110,000 combat sorties in Europe and had one of the lowest loss rates of any United States bomber. Harlan Sanders became the face of Kentucky Fried Chicken, then spent years publicly criticizing the company he sold. He sold it for $2 million in 1964, and in 1978, the company sued him after he called its gravy wallpaper paste. Mikhail Gorbachev and Fidel Castro ride through Havana in 1989, just before the Soviet bloc began to fall apart. The Soviet Union ended in 1991, and Cuba soon entered the deep economic crisis called the Special Period. Early 2000s game nights looked like this: heavy screen boxes, hanging cables, and players packed into one room for local network matches. Before fast home internet became common, this setup gave much lower delay. A National Guard soldier stops a driver during the 1968 Democratic National Convention protests in Grant Park, Chicago. The unrest became one of the most famous convention crises in United States history and led to the Chicago 7 trial in 1969. Marilyn Monroe pauses for a quick hair and makeup retouch on the Arizona set of Bus Stop in 1956. Bus Stop was released in 1956 and brought her one of the strongest reviews of her career. The Krupp K-12 railway gun was one of the most extreme long-range guns of 1942, built to send shells from rail tracks across remarkable distances. Its barrel was about 33 meters long, and it had to use a curved section of track just to change aim. Sergeant Olin Dowse called out in fluent German during the fighting in France in 1944, and 56 hidden German soldiers suddenly walked toward him with their hands raised. During Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart wore platform shoes in some scenes to look closer in height to Ingrid Bergman. Casablanca was released in 1942 and won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1944. French resistance members escort surrendered German soldiers through a street in France in 1944, showing how quickly power changed after towns were freed. A United States Navy sailor sits on crushed vehicles aboard USS Nevada after the Crossroads Able test in July 1946. Nevada had already survived Pearl Harbor, Normandy, and Iwo Jima before being turned into a target ship in 1946. Franz von Papen leaves New York City in December 1915 after the United States forced him out as an unwelcome German diplomat. He later became Chancellor of Germany in 1932 and helped clear the path for Adolf Hitler to take power in 1933. Howard Hughes had not appeared in public since 1961, so by 1976 he had become one of the most elusive figures in America. He was 70 years old on April 5, 1976, and his isolation had lasted about 15 years. The Headington Shark looks like it fell straight through a quiet house roof in Oxford, turning an ordinary street into one of the strangest sights in England. The sculpture was installed in 1986 at 2 New High Street, and it is about 7.6 meters long. A German king tiger sits abandoned near the Seelow Heights in spring 1945 during the final push toward Berlin. The assault on the Seelow Heights began on the 16th of April 1945, and Berlin fell on the 2nd of May 1945. A United States Marine removed Saddam Hussein's portrait from a school wall in Al-Qut in April 2003 as old power symbols vanished in public view. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, and Saddam Hussein was captured in December 2003. The burned Miami showband bus became one of the most haunting images of the Troubles in Ireland in 1975. The attack happened on July 31, 1975, near Newry, and 3 band members died while 2 survived. A former prisoner drags a guard by the hair at Dora Mittelbau in April 1945, just after American troops reached the camp. Prisoners there were forced to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels near Nordhausen. Survivors stand outside a block at Auschwitz just after the Red Army reached the camp in January 1945. About 7,000 prisoners were still there when Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945. A rare side profile shows the German leader shortly after the failed July 1944 plot, with visible damage to his hair and a rigid expression. The attack happened on July 20, 1944, at the Wolf's Lair, and he remained in power until April 1945. Marcus Wayne Cheneau Jr. is led away after the 1974 church attack at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, a place deeply tied to the King family. Alberta Williams King was 69 years old, and church deacon Edward Boykin also died there on June 30, 1974. Smoke covers an aircraft at Rome Fiumicino Airport during one of the deadliest airport attacks of the 1970s. On December 17, 1973, 5 gunmen killed 34 people, set a Pan American jet on fire, and hijacked Lufthansa Flight 303. Jesse Owens arrives in London in 1936, just after becoming the biggest star of the Berlin Olympics. In Berlin, he won 4 gold medals in the 100 meters, 200 meters, long jump, and 4x100-meter relay. Tab Hunter and Anthony Perkins appear on a public double date in 1956, when 2 of Hollywood's biggest young stars had to hide their real relationship. Hunter later confirmed it in his 2005 book. A mother leads her children through a shattered Liverpool back alley in 1962, turning everyday life into a scene that looks almost unreal. In the early 1960s, Liverpool was clearing large areas of inner-city slum housing. Jane Mansfield and Mickey Hargitay relax on a speedboat in the early 1960s when they were one of Hollywood's most photographed couples. They married in 1958 and divorced in 1964 after having 3 children together. A British soldier reads the first stark warning sign raised at Belsen after the camp was liberated in 1945. The sign records 10,000 unburied dead found there and another 13,000 deaths after the British arrived on the 15th of April, 1945. A United States Marine recruit stands inches from his drill sergeant in 1971, showing how intense training could look in a single moment. Marine training was built on strict discipline, constant repetition, and instant response to orders. Marlon Brando stands with Black Panther members in April 1968, days after 17-year-old Bobby Hutton was killed in Oakland. Hutton was the first member of the Black Panther Party, and he was 17 years old when he died. Tony Ray Jones caught England at its strangest. Swimsuit contestants stand beside a tea drinking judge in a crowded hall. He made his best-known photos in the late 1960s and died in 1972 at age 30. A World War II Navy sea diver poses in a heavy canvas suit beside a brass helmet built for deep work below the surface. Standard hard hat rigs used surface-pumped air, and the copper and brass helmet could weigh more than 25 kilograms. Rita Hayworth cuts her 29th birthday cake with Orson Welles beside her, while Errol Flynn and Nora Eddington join the celebration. Hayworth was born in 1918, so this party took place in 1947. Brian Wilson sits on the tracks moments before a Navy munitions train hit him during an anti-war protest in California in 1987. The train was moving about 17 miles per hour in a 5-mile-per-hour zone, and he lost both legs below the knee. People run through Lower Manhattan after the collapse of one of the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. Nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks, and both towers fell that morning in New York City. A young Vietnamese woman reads papers beside a rifle during the Vietnam War era. The conflict lasted from the 1950s to 1975, and Vietnam was formally reunified in 1976. Chinese children reach for food during the Great Chinese Famine under Mao's Great Leap Forward. From 1959 to 1961, tens of millions died across China. Palestinian civilians leave Haifa in 1948 under armed escort during the war around the end of the British Mandate. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in 1948, and Haifa came under Israeli control in April 1948. Rescue workers searched the destroyed Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires after the 1994 attack. The blast killed 85 people, injured more than 300, and remains the deadliest attack in Argentina's history. John F. Kennedy greets the crowd at his inaugural ball in 1961, with Jacqueline Kennedy beside him. He took office on January 20, 1961, and he was 43 years old. A Jewish immigrant family stands beside piled bedding and sacks during an eviction on Manhattan's Lower East Side in 1910. At that time, the neighborhood was packed with tenement housing and one of the largest Jewish immigrant communities in New York. Israeli soldiers raise a makeshift flag in the desert in one of the most famous images from the 1948 war. The ink flag was raised at Rashrash on March 10, 1949, and the site later became Eilat. Hitler appears with Catholic clergy after the Reichskonkordat linked the Vatican and Germany in 1933. The agreement was signed on July 20, 1933, by Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, and Franz von Papen. Students at Tehran University pulled down a statue of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi during the Iranian Revolution. The Shah left Iran on the 16th of January, 1979, and the monarchy collapsed on the 11th of February, 1979. Fidel Castro shows a rural Cuban man how to use a rifle during the Cuban Revolution. The revolution lasted from 1953 to 1959, and Castro took power in Cuba in 1959. Philippe Petit walked on a wire between the towers of Notre Dame in Paris in 1971. He was 21 years old, and the wire was about 45 meters above the square on June 26, 1971. Wrecked German vehicles lie near Spreewald during the Battle of Halbe in late April 1945. The battle was fought southeast of Berlin, where trapped German forces tried to break west through Soviet lines. One of the last known photos shows Adolf Hitler inspecting damage at his Berlin bunker complex in April 1945. It was taken on April 20, 1945, his 56th birthday, with Julius Schaub standing beside him. A mechanic repairs a B-17 in 1943 using a British lifting bag to raise the bomber off the ground. The B-17 was a main 8th Air Force bomber in Europe, and field crews worked fast to return damaged aircraft to service. French soldiers crossed the Meuse River on horseback on the road to Verdun in 1916. The Verdun campaign lasted 303 days and became one of the longest operations of World War I. 33-year-old Mick Meaney lies in the coffin that was lowered under a street in Kilburn, London, in February 1968 for a world record attempt. He remained underground for 61 days and returned to the surface on the 22nd of April, 1968. Contortionist Percy bends into an extreme pose that makes his face appear between his legs. He was identified in print only as Percy, and this image records one of his stage contortion poses. 60-year-old Sergeant Gander balances 59 kilograms on his head with no visible support. That is about 130 pounds held above his neck in a single strength act. Contestants crawl across the pavement in the 1959 pea pushing contest, driving a single pea forward with their noses. The rule was simple: one pea, one nose, and no hands. The diver looks like a machine from another world, but this was routine tank cleaning at the Miami Seaquarium in 1959. He used a hard helmet suit and a suction hose to remove sand and debris from the aquarium floor. A customer sits at a row of coin-operated film viewers selling short dance shows with titles like Hot Tango and these machines offered private peep films for 1 or 5 cents in early 20th century arcades. At a holiday camp beauty contest, the women lie in a row while judges study their legs and figure one by one. The judging was based on body shape rather than facial appearance. The 1951 Miss Lou Brack poses in a working garage with 5 mechanics under a raised car. Her title is written on the sign in front of her, and the photo was staged inside an auto service bay. Automobile polo turned a simple ball game into something surreal, with players leaning out of moving cars to hit the ball with rackets. The sport appeared in the 1920s and 1930s, and many matches ended with bent fenders, broken wheels, and badly damaged cars. 2 dolphins rise from the water as a trainer conducts them like a tiny underwater orchestra. The music board in front of them reads Deep Sea Blues, and the photo was staged at an animal psychology center. A man poses in a hive-shaped headpiece made from live bees, with only his face left uncovered. The insects form a dense cap and beard around his head like a living helmet. In 1929, Mrs. W. Scott raced a car against Captain Davis in an airplane on a steep banked track. The photo shows the car on the course while the biplane flies low beside it. A woman demonstrates an automatic milk lock fitted to a front door so a bottle could be delivered without being left outside. The sign reads, Automatic Milk Locks, and promises clean milk and safe delivery. In 1964, an NAACP voter registration volunteer walks with a dog wearing a sign that says, I cannot vote because I am a dog. What is your excuse? Register today. Women compete in a 1953 vacuum cleaning contest, pushing upright cleaners across a marked strip while judges stand beside them. The photo shows multiple contestants working side by side in front of a crowd and an official judging line. A woman water skis beside a floating platform carrying a grand piano and a seated pianist. The skier holds the tow rope while the piano stands on a raft moving across the water. A fish swam into the flooded lower half of a diver's mask and ended up pressed against the front glass. The mask is partly full of water, which made it possible for the fish to enter and stay inside for the photo. Peggy Van Vliet posed inside a publicity prop billed as the world's largest iced coffee glass. She was presented as the Coffee Queen of 1940. World War II clothing drives asked civilians to donate spare clothes so the material could be reused for the war effort. In Times Square, this promoter wore a barrel printed, I did my bit. Did you? To turn that message into a walking advertisement. He is mowing a turf roof, a real roof type used as natural insulation long before modern green roofs became fashionable. A packed grass layer helped hold heat in winter, stay cooler in summer, and protect the structure below. In 1930, a perfect back contest used an X-ray machine to judge spinal alignment instead of just outward appearance. The contestant was examined by a chiropractor, turning posture into a public contest measured by medical imaging. Gail Hooper was promoted as Miss National Catfish in 1954, a title used to advertise the catfish industry. The photo turned that campaign into a publicity image by pairing her with a giant catfish above the Manhattan skyline. In 1935, messenger boys posed in identical Eddie Cantor masks, turning a famous comedian's face into a group costume. Cantor was a major radio, film, and stage star in the 1930s, and his wide eyes and heavy eyebrows were famous enough to be sold as novelty masks. At the first baseball game in the Houston Astrodome, even the grounds crew wore helmeted uniforms that looked like space gear. The stadium opened in 1965 and was promoted as the 8th wonder of the world. This contest turned sitting still into an endurance event, with contestants perched on tall stools for as long as possible. An official timekeeper stood below, while each participant remained alone on a numbered post. A hat seller carries what looks like his whole stock on his head in a single trip. The stack holds more than a dozen straw hats and rises far above the people around him. This 1943 image shows German troops riding a Panzer IV AOSFG during the Third Battle of Kharkov. Kharkov was retaken by German forces in March 1943, making it one of their last major victories on the Eastern Front. This is an alternate angle of the famous Stalingrad cover photo with the Heer soldiers and their MP-40S behind the same dirt embankment. The matching crater, telegraph poles, and road line place both images in the same Stalingrad scene in summer 1942. On April 20, 1945, Me-262 pilot Edward Schalmoser came down by parachute after his aircraft hit an American Martin B-26 Marauder over Germany. He landed in the garden outside his parents' house, directly in front of his stunned mother. A German, a Finn, and a Russian share a cigarette outside a military hospital in Kaunas, Karelia. The photo was taken on September 17, 1941, during the Continuation War in East Karelia. A box of German steel hand granaten was dug up in Ukraine, still arranged almost exactly like a World War II delivery crate. The find preserves the original transport layout, with the long-handled grenades packed side by side more than 80 years after burial. This rare angle shows Hitler speaking in Frankfurt's Festhalle on March 16, 1936, just 9 days after German troops entered the demilitarized Rhineland. The speech came during the campaign for the March 29, 1936 referendum. In 1940, Hitler returned to Fromelles, one of the French sectors where he had served in World War I. He had been there with Reserve Infantry Regiment 16, known as the List Regiment, more than 25 years earlier. Philippe de Gaulle, son of Charles de Gaulle, reads the order of the day while serving with the French 2nd Armored Division in Normandy in 1944. He was 22 years old in this photo and later became an admiral in the French Navy. A French colonial soldier escorts 2 Algerian men in restraints in colonial Algeria. France ruled Algeria from 1830 to 1962, and the War for Algerian Independence lasted from 1954 to 1962. French members of Jean-Baptiste Charcot's expedition drank champagne beside their ship after reaching Antarctica in 1904. Charcot's first Antarctic voyage lasted from 1903 to 1905 and mapped parts of the Antarctic Peninsula. In 1904, a woman posed in a bat-themed costume decades before Batgirl existed in comics. Batgirl first appeared in 1961, which puts this photo 57 years earlier. In 1942, Soviet civilians, most of them women, dug anti-tank ditches at the foot of the Caucasus as the front moved toward the region. These defenses were built during the German drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in the summer of 1942. On March 16, 1936, Adolf Hitler spoke in Frankfurt, 9 days after German troops entered the Rhineland. The speech was part of the campaign before the March 29, 1936 referendum used to show public support for that move. On April 7, 1945, Yamato, one of the largest battleships ever built, was lost to United States carrier aircraft north of Okinawa. About 3,055 of her 3,332 crew were lost when a forward magazine detonated during Operation 10 Go. A United States Marine fires from a shell hole on Tarawa in November 1943, one of the Pacific War's most famous island battle images. Tarawa was secured in 76 hours, but more than 1,000 United States Marines were lost in that single operation. On October 13, 1945, Japanese women and children waited aboard the destroyer Maki as people were being taken home from the Philippines after the war. About 30,000 Japanese had lived in the Philippines before the war, and only about half survived to return. Dutch soldiers take cover on the Rotterdam Quay during the German attack in May 1940, with a Lewis light machine gun visible at the left edge. The Netherlands surrendered on May 15, 1940, only 5 days after the invasion began. A lightning strike triggered a giant oil tank fire in San Luis Obispo on April 7, 1926. At least 2 tanks were lost, and the damage was estimated at $10 million. In the mid-1960s, one man turned himself into a walking protest for husband liberation and husband suffrage. The signs mock changing gender roles by demanding obedient wives, prepared meals, and children watched at home. A young couple pose at their wedding in January 1955, years before this image took on a very different meaning in popular memory. The bride was Rosalie Jean Willis, and the marriage took place in California in 1955. Hoovervilles were shanty towns built by people ruined by the Great Depression and named in open blame after President Herbert Hoover. By the early 1930s, these camps had spread across major United States cities, with families living in shelters made from scrap wood, tin, and tar paper. In 1962, French cyclist José Meffret reached 204.73 kilometers per hour by riding in the slipstream behind a Mercedes-Benz 300 SL. That world record stood for nearly 20 years. At New York's Waldorf Astoria, a sheep and a goose were photographed riding an elevator together. The photo put 2 farm animals inside one of America's most famous luxury hotels. George Stern demonstrated a fast evaporating liquid that let him briefly hold flames on his palms without injury. The effect worked because the liquid evaporated so quickly that the heat did not stay on the skin long enough to cause damage. During a house move, the entire building slid off the transport truck and nearly dropped into the ditch. The failed crossing left the house wedged at a sharp angle beside the bridge. 3 chimpanzees were used in staged entertainment acts like this because animal bicycle tricks were a popular circus attraction in the early 20th century. This photo shows a stacked riding act with matching outfits. This wedding was billed as the first parachute marriage, with the couple suspended in separate seats under parachutes. Groom Arno Rudolphi said, "No man on earth was good enough for her." Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin, Myra Gale Brown, in 1957, and the news badly damaged his career just as he was becoming a major star. He was still legally married to his previous wife when they wed on December 12, 1957. In December 1972, B-52 bombers took off from Andersen Air Force Base on Guam for the Linebacker 2 air campaign over North Vietnam. The operation lasted 11 days and focused on Hanoi and Haiphong after negotiations broke down. In 1945, a Japanese aircraft struck the carrier Enterprise and sent the forward elevator 120 meters into the air. The photo was taken from the carrier Essex during the Okinawa campaign off Kyushu. This photo was taken during the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, when German troops marched Jewish civilians to collection points in May 1943. The uprising began on April 19, 1943, and the ghetto was declared crushed on May 16, 1943. Private Joseph Bailey of the Sheffield Battalion was photographed at the Somme in 1916, only hours before he died in action. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1, 1916, and became one of the deadliest campaigns of World War I. Kanowan was photographed on Nunivak Island, Alaska, on February 28, 1929, wearing the beadwork and ornaments of her native Alaskan community. In Pljevlja, in 1943, Yugoslav partisans used an improvised anti-lice system made from a barrel and a damaged Italian disinfection cart. A similar device was already known in World War I as the Serbian barrel, used to kill lice with heat. In the 1950s, Las Vegas turned nearby nuclear test clouds into a tourist attraction. From 1951, blasts at the Nevada test site were visible from the city, and some hotels even hosted dawn viewing parties. This 1947 yearbook photo shows James Hong decades before he became one of the most recognizable Chinese-American actors in film and television. His screen career lasted more than 70 years and grew to hundreds of credited roles. In the meantime, let's see these photos. Write in the comments which historical frame you like the most and for what reason. On October 4, 1944, Italian partisans in Florence cheered as a South African 6th Armored Division tank moved in against a German sniper position. Florence had already been largely liberated in August 1944, but isolated fighting still continued inside the city weeks later. Charles Sherwood Stratton, known worldwide as General Tom Thumb, stands with Lavinia Warren in one of the biggest celebrity marriages of the 1800s. Their 1863 wedding drew such huge crowds and press coverage that it briefly pushed American Civil War news off newspaper front pages. In 1899, Nicholas II and Alexandra were photographed visiting family in Germany, just 15 years before Russia and Germany went to war in World War I. The photo was taken at Wolfsgarten Castle in October 1899. Andras Toma spent 55 years in a Soviet psychiatric hospital after his 1945 capture, making him one of the last World War II soldiers to return home. In 2000, his Hungarian was finally recognized, and he was identified and taken back to Hungary. A United States Army sniper carries an M1903A for Springfield near Capas, Tarlac in the Philippines in 1945. The M19 was built without standard iron sights because the telescopic sight mount took their place. In 1940, Chinese General Nie Rongzhen was photographed with a Japanese child he chose to protect in Hebei. The girl was the daughter of the deputy station master at the Jingxing coal mine railway station, and she was later sent to the local Japanese garrison. May Vandermark, known as Miss Artorio, became famous in American sideshows as a heavily tattooed performer in the early 20th century. Born in 1907, she later worked with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey and traveled widely on tour. Jerry Danzig photographed Billie Holiday in 1957 during her 2-week run at Sugar Hill nightclub, capturing moments far from the stage. These images were made just 2 years before she died in 1959 at age 44. On January 26, 1945, a paratrooper of Italy's 3rd Azzurro Parachute Battalion stood guard at San Filippo Neri College in Lanzo, Piedmont. The photo was taken less than 4 months before the war in Italy ended in May 1945. In 1926, Violet Gibson came within inches of changing Italian history when her shot only grazed Benito Mussolini's nose in Rome. She was 50 years old. The attack happened on April 7, 1926, and she spent the rest of her life in a British asylum. In 1880, Maurice Vidal Portman led the first armed expedition to North Sentinel Island and took several children off the island for study. They were returned gravely ill with disease, and this episode is often cited as one reason the islanders rejected all later outsiders. Pottery Cottage became one of Britain's most infamous hostage cases after an escaped prisoner forced a family inside during the Derbyshire blizzard of January 1977. The siege lasted more than 2 days, involved 5 hostages. In 1981, David Kerwin jumped into Yellowstone's Celestine Pool to save a dog without knowing the spring was about 93 degrees Celsius. He died the next day, and the dog was also lost in the pool. Pottery Cottage became one of Britain's most infamous hostage sieges after an escaped prisoner forced a family inside during the Derbyshire blizzard of January 1977. The standoff lasted more than 2 days and ended with only one of the 5 hostages surviving. English boxer Eric Pleasance later joined the British Free Corps, the tiny Waffen-SS unit made up of British volunteers. After the war, he spent 7 years in a Soviet gulag because officials believed he was a British spy. From 1967 to 1986, Albania built more than 750,000 bunkers, roughly 1 for every 4 people in the country. They were meant for a foreign attack that never came, and most were still unused when communism in Albania ended. In 1958, 14-year-old Cheryl Crane, Lana Turner's daughter, became the center of a major Hollywood scandal after Johnny Stompanato died at Turner's home. Stompanato was linked to Mickey Cohen, and the inquest ruled the death justifiable homicide. In 1953, West Germany passed a compensation law, but many victims of Nazi persecution still had to fight for years to get paid. Romani survivors were often denied because courts classified much of their persecution as police action rather than racial persecution. In 1968, near Da Nang, a United States Marine carried a rescued puppy in his jacket pocket. He served with the 7th Marines in Vietnam. Paul Frey designed a rat-shaped coin purse for La Cloche Frere, turning a small luxury item into a novelty object. The design became popular in the early 1900s. On April 1, 1984, Marvin Gaye Sr. was arrested after Marvin Gaye died at the family home in Los Angeles. The singer was 44 years old and would have turned 45 the next day. Budapest's Millennium Underground opened in 1896 as the first underground railway on the European mainland. This train ran beneath Heroes Square during the line's opening year, built for Hungary's 1,000-year anniversary celebrations. This group was photographed in Leningrad shortly before the fabricated deaf-mute group case turned their gathering into a state crime. A total of 55 disabled people were arrested, 35 were later shot, and the rest were sent to labor camps for 10 years. A young Michelle Obama stands with her mother, father, and brother in a family photo from the 1970s. She became the first black First Lady of the United States in 2009. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin, marking the public end of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned that evening, and the Soviet Union formally ended on December 26, 1991. In 1914, soldaderas were armed women who traveled with Mexican revolutionary armies and sometimes fought beside them. Railways were vital to the Mexican Revolution, so women like this were often photographed beside troop trains. In 1989, exiled former Ugandan ruler Idi Amin flew to Zaire hoping to launch a return to Uganda. He was recognized at the airport, stopped before he could leave, and sent back into exile. In 1944 in Burma, Korean women were freed from a Japanese military facility and photographed just after liberation. The image also includes Japanese-American soldiers from the United States unit involved in the operation. Chinese communist fighters used tunnel warfare in North China to move, hide, and strike through underground passages. This photo was taken in central Hebei in 1943 by Sha Fei during a demonstration against Japanese forces. Fred Howe was a late 1800s sideshow star who even performed comic boxing matches. At his peak, he weighed about 500 to 600 pounds and died in 1899. The B-24 Lady Be Good vanished over the Libyan desert on April 4, 1943, after missing its base and running out of fuel. The wreck was found in 1958, and the crew died trying to walk out of the desert. Katharina Sanduina became famous after defeating Eugen Sandow in a lifting contest, and her stage name was taken from his. She later used her circus fame to speak openly for women's rights and women's health. Michael and Robert Rosenberg were photographed in 1951 as their parents became the most famous defendants in an American atomic espionage case. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 after being convicted of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. In 1942, Swedish warships were hidden at Smorkullen, where the coastline itself worked as camouflage during World War II. Sweden stayed neutral, but still fortified its coast and concealed parts of its fleet against possible attack. In 1999, Saddam Hussein was photographed with bodyguards during Eid al-Fitr in Iraq. The image was taken 4 years before his rule ended in 2003. Franz Ritter von Epp, fought in 4 German wars on 3 continents, so his career stretched from Imperial Germany to the Third Reich. He later became Nazi Reichskommissar in Bavaria and is linked to both the Herero. In 1997, Albania fell so deeply into unrest that civilians raided army depots and set up their own road checkpoints. The crisis followed the collapse of nationwide pyramid schemes and became so severe that an international force was sent in. In Brussels in 1950, people were already protesting NATO just 1 year after the alliance was created in 1949. Their signs link NATO rearmament with misery and war, capturing how fast the Cold War split Europe. Japan's most visible socialist leader gave blood in front of the press, turning a hospital bed into a political message. On September 28, 1950 in Tokyo, Inajiro Asanuma joined a public campaign to help United Nations soldiers injured during the Korean War. A grainy police photo captured the night Norway's black metal world stopped being just music. On August 19, 1993 in Oslo, Varg Vikernes was taken into custody shortly after the death of Øystein Aarseth. One truck bomb ripped through central Manchester during Euro 1996 and turned a busy city street into a field of glass and steel. On the 15th of June 1996, the IRA attack injured more than 200 people and caused about £700 million in damage. Richard Nixon paused to talk with a White House gardener as workers prepared the grounds for Tricia Nixon's wedding. In June 1971, Tricia Nixon married Edward Cox in the White House Rose Garden before hundreds of guests. A Viet Minh soldier shook hands with a wounded French captive after one of France's biggest colonial defeats in Asia. In May 1954, the fall of Dien Bien Phu ended the battle and pushed France toward withdrawal from Indochina. A strike meant for a German aircraft plant shattered the center of Mortsel instead. On April 5, 1943, near Antwerp, the failed raid ruined large parts of the town and led to more than 900 civilian deaths. One priest with a white handkerchief became the human signal of chaos in Derry, guiding people as 17-year-old Jackie Duddy was carried beside him. On January 30, 1972, this scene unfolded during Bloody Sunday, and Duddy later died in hospital. Otto Ambros stood in headphones as the Nuremberg tribunal read a sentence that would last far less than it sounded. On July 30, 1948 in Germany, a United States military court gave him 8 years. He served about 3 and later worked for major corporations. A Good Friday crowd filled a narrow Jerusalem street in 1942 with a large wooden cross rising above the heads of the procession. That year, Jerusalem was still under the British mandate, and these public Holy Week rituals continued during the Second World War. At 10 years old, Sarah Rector received 160 acres in Oklahoma that many saw as useless land. After oil was found there in 1913, she became one of the first black millionaires in the United States. Bruce Larson turned 1 second at an Alabama rally into a direct public challenge. In 1986, his girlfriend took this photo through a sunroof as he confronted a Ku Klux Klan member. A sea of tents turned the Jordan Valley into a new town for Palestinians displaced in 1948. By the end of that war, about 700,000 Palestinians had left or lost their homes, and camps like this became their first shelter. A Los Angeles sidewalk became a stage for public humiliation as Mexican-American youths were attacked during the Zoot Suit riots. In June 1943, United States Navy sailors targeted children, teenagers, and young men in zoot suits because wartime fabric rules turned the outfits into a political symbol. Ariel Sharon's face in this photo belonged to a commander whose 1953 raid would shadow his rise for decades. In October 1953, Unit 101 attacked Kibya in the West Bank. 77 civilians died, and Sharon later became Prime Minister of Israel. A simple seesaw in this settlement photo was hiding a secret under the ground. In 1946 in Palestine, British forces found that its middle support was a vent for an underground Haganah cache with more than 300 rifles, 100 mortars, 400,000 bullets, 5,000 grenades, and 78 revolvers. 13-year-old Barbara Kent played in a New Mexico river just hours after the Trinity test lit the desert 40 miles away. This photo was taken on July 16, 1945, near Ruidoso, and Barbara was the only person in the frame known to live past 30. Andre the Giant looked unreal even off the ring, with a body so large he seemed built for myth. Born in 1946, he grew to about 7 foot 4 inches and more than 500 pounds, then became a global star in wrestling and in The Princess Bride. 15-year-old Johnny Gray refused to shrink on a Little Rock sidewalk and turned a school walk into a civil rights image. On September 16, 1958 in Arkansas, he confronted one of 2 white boys who tried to force him. A student protest at Kent State turned into one of the most infamous days ever seen on an American campus. In 1970, the Ohio National Guard moved in after protests over the Vietnam War and the Cambodia invasion, and 4 students died that day. A thin wooden post and 2 armed men were all that separated the United States from Mexico in this 1915 border photo. It shows a United States soldier and a Mexican soldier on the Arizona line during the tense years of the Mexican Revolution. This was a rehearsal for public harassment, not a normal classroom scene. In Petersburg, Virginia, in 1960, black civil rights volunteers practiced staying nonviolent during sit-ins, while others acted as hostile white opponents. Liberation at Bergen-Belsen was only days old when inmates turned on a former capo. On April 16, 1945, newly freed prisoners chased him through the camp and attacked him in public view. Junko Furuta became the face of one of Japan's most haunting crime cases. Kidnapped in November 1988, she was held for 40 days and died on January 4, 1989, at age 17. Before film fame, he trained as a ballet dancer with unusual control and speed. In the 1970s, an old knee injury ended that path and pushed him toward acting. Iranian women played volleyball in sleeveless uniforms before the 1979 revolution sharply changed public life for female athletes. Women's volleyball had national competition in Iran by 1975. One black man stood inside a Ku Klux Klan rally in Jackson, Mississippi, facing a crowd in white robes almost alone. In 1950, the photo captured him only yards from the group and its lit cross. This is believed to be the only known photograph of Celia, an enslaved Missouri teenager whose case exposed the brutal logic of slavery. In 1855, an all-white male jury convicted her after she fatally resisted her enslaver, and she was later executed. Barefoot in the snow, a coal miner's son searched roadside mine refuse for coal with a pick. He was photographed in Scotts Run, West Virginia, on December 23, 1936, about a quarter mile from home. Palestinian women and children were gathered by Israeli forces in Tantura after the village was taken in 1948. That war displaced about 700,000 Palestinians and emptied or destroyed hundreds of Arab villages. This wrecked Hebron room marked the collapse of one of the city's oldest Jewish communities. On August 24, 1929, Arab attackers killed 67 Jews, and the surviving community was removed from Hebron soon after. Black smoke rose over Haifa as an Italian air raid hit the Muslim graveyard and the Istiklal Mosque. In September 1940, the attack reached British Mandate Palestine during Italy's war against Britain. French FTP fighters turned hidden fields and roadside cover into battle lines under German occupation. In 1942 and 1943, FTP units carried out armed attacks on German patrols and military vehicles across occupied France. In the 1930s in Roxborough, North Carolina, a mob stood with police after failing to force its way into the county jail. The target was a black man held inside, and the photo shows how racial violence could gather in public beside law officers. A Palestinian Christian family posed with an Orthodox priest in Ramallah when Palestine was still under Ottoman rule. It was taken in 1900, 17 years before British rule replaced Ottoman rule in Palestine. Egyptian women stood at the center of the 1919 uprising, turning street protest into a public challenge to British rule. The revolt helped force Britain to declare Egypt independent in 1922, though Britain still kept major control. Twisted circus cars and steam turned Hammond into the site of one of the worst train disasters in circus history. On June 22, 1918, 2 Hagenbeck-Wallace circus trains crashed at 4 in the morning, with 89 lives lost and about 150 people hurt. Subhash Chandra Bose appears here with a Japanese submarine crew during one of the rarest wartime journeys ever photographed. In May 1943, he crossed the Indian Ocean by submarine to seek support for India's independence movement. Refugees streamed out of Belgrade on foot after American bombing hit the city during Easter 1944. In April 1944, civilians left occupied Belgrade carrying children, bags, and blankets. A rare night photo caught German flares over an American bomber base deep inside the Soviet Union. In 1944, the raid at Poltava destroyed many United States planes on the ground during Operation Frantic. Tauhida Ben Sheikh brought family planning education directly to Tunisian women instead of waiting for them to reach a clinic. Born in 1909, she became the first modern woman physician in Tunisia and North Africa, and later led major work in women's health. The first FA Cup winners sat for this team photo just after football's oldest knockout final entered history. In 1872, Wanderers beat Royal Engineers 1-0 at the Kennington Oval in London. Omar al-Bashir stands here just after the moment that changed Sudan for decades. In 1989, army officers took power in Khartoum, and Bashir went on to rule Sudan for 30 years. A fresh farmhouse with a fenced yard and glassed porch stood out in Zolskaya's rural landscape. It was built for a farmer in Stavropol territory in 1958. John Higgs played guitar upside down from a tree, turning a stunt into a bizarre photo. He said he kept playing for 8 straight hours and claimed it as a world record. I will be very grateful for subscribing to the channel. Every day I post rare and really interesting historical photos.